We were studying the book, The First and Last Freedom by Krishnamurti. In that, we were studying about awareness. Let us recall whatever we studied in the last class, then continue with the next. He started with to know ourselves. He started with to know ourselves means to know our relationship with the world. He says to know ourselves, we should know our relationship with the world. He says not only with the world of ideas and people, but also with the nature, with the things we possess. To know ourselves, we should know our relationship with all these things. He also explains further to understand this relationship, we don't require specialization the way we require in the technical things. It is not required the specialization. And he asks further how is one to have how to be aware of this whole process of relationship. Before going to that, he says understanding of this realization relationship does not require specialization, but what he says is it demands awareness to meet life as a whole. He says we should have the awareness to meet the life as a whole. And he also explains to understand this relationship does not mean isolation. On the contrary, it demands a full recognition or awareness of the total process of relationship. He says that we need to have the awareness of the total process of relationship. And he also asks so many questions about how is one to be aware and different things. How are we aware of anything? How are you going to have awareness about your relationship with a person? In that, he says, well, after asking the questions, he says, we are aware. He says, we are aware of a response to a stimulus. He says that we are aware of a response to a stimulus, which is an obvious fact. And he gives an example here. I see the trees. When we see the trees, there is a response. Then there is sensation, then contact, identification, and desire. This is what happens when we see a tree. That is the ordinary process. We can observe what actually takes place without studying any books. He says we can observe what is happening without studying any books. In these two paragraphs, what he has explained to us is to know ourselves, we should know we must know our relationship with the world. That means not only with the world of ideas and people, but also with the nature and with the things we possess. For this, he says the specialization is not required. To understand the relationship, he says the specialization is not required. What is required is the awareness to meet the life as a whole. And also, he has given an example. He says, whenever we see a tree, there is a response. Then he says, then there is a sensation and contact, identification, desire. He says, this is a simple process, ordinary process, what actually takes place without studying any books. This is what we understood by first two paragraphs this chapter awareness. Let us see what is he is explaining or giving lecture on the further in this chapter. So, through identification, you have pleasure and pain. And our capacity is this concern with pleasure and the avoidance of pain, is it not? If you are interested in something, if it gives you pleasure, there is a capacity immediately. There is an awareness of that fact immediately. And if it is painful, the capacity is developed to avoid it. So, so long as we are looking to capacity to understand ourselves, I think we shall fail because The understanding of ourselves does not depend on capacity. It is not a technique that you develop, cultivate, and increase through time, through constant sharpening. This awareness of oneself can be tested surely in the action of relationship. It can be tested in the way we talk, the way we behave. Watch yourself without any identification, without any comparison, without any condemnation. Just watch, and you will see an extraordinary thing taking place. You not only put an end to an activity which is unconscious, because most of our activities are unconscious, you not only bring that to an end, but further, you are aware of the motives of that action without inquiry, without digging into it. When you are aware, you see the whole process of our thinking and action. But it can happen only when there is no condemnation. When I condemn something, I do not understand it. And it is one way of avoiding any kind of understanding. I think most of us do that purposely. We condemn immediately and we think we have understood. If we do not condemn, if we do not condemn, but regard it or aware of it, then the content, the significance of that action begins to open up. Experiment with this and you will see for yourself. Just be aware without any sense of justification, which may appear negative but is not negative. On the contrary, it has the quality of passivity, which is direct action. And you will discover this if you experiment with it. After all, if you want to understand something, you have to be in a passive mode. Do you not? You cannot keep on thinking about it, speculating about it, or questioning it. You have to be sensitive through to receive the content of it. It is like being a sensitive photographic plate. If I want to understand you, I have to be passively aware. Then you begin to tell me all your story. Surely that is not a question of capacity or specialization. In that process, we begin to understand ourselves, not only the superficial layers of our consciousness, but the deeper, which is much more important, because there are all our motives, our intentions, our hidden, confused demands, anxieties, fears, appetites. Outwardly, we may have them all under control, but inwardly, they are boiling. Until those have been completely understood through awareness, obviously there cannot be freedom, there cannot be happiness, there is no intelligence. Let us see what we understand, what he is trying to explain in these three paragraphs which we have gone through. What he says is we are going to build the capacity depending on whether we want to have a pleasure or we want to avoid a pain. That is called as capacity. He says through identification you have pleasure or pain. If you are interested in something, if it gives you pleasure, there is a capacity immediately. If you are interested, we are going to build a capacity to gain it. And if there is an awareness of that fact immediately, and if it is painful, if something it is painful, the capacity is developed to avoid it. So we are going to build two types of capacity. One is to gain the pleasure or which we want, or other one to avoid which we do not want. So we are going to build a capacity. So what he says is, so long as if we are trying to looking for a capacity to understand ourselves, If we are looking for a capacity to understand ourselves, then he says we are going to fail, because the understanding of ourselves does not depend on the capacity. See, what he says is to understand ourselves, that does not depend on the capacity. The understanding is not a technique that you develop, cultivate, increase through time. To do that, the time is not required through constantly sharpening. So, to understand, technique is not required. It is not a technique. See, technique to learn a technique, we need to develop, cultivate, increase through time. But this is not a technique. To understand ourselves is not a technique. This awareness of oneself can be tested surely. How he says how this awareness can be tested. He says this awareness of oneself can be tested surely in the action of relationship. He says it can be tested in the action of relationship. It can be tested in the way we talk. He says it can be tested the way we talk, the way we behave. The relationship, the understanding of relationship can be tested in the way we talk, the way we behave. And he further says, watch yourself. He says, watch yourself. He is asking us to watch ourselves. Watch ourselves without any identification. We need to watch ourselves without any identification of ours, without any comparison. We should watch ourselves without comparing with anybody or anything. He says, watch without comparison and watch without any condemnation. We need to watch ourselves without condemning ourselves. He says, without watch yourself without any condemnation. Just watch. He is asking us to watch ourselves. Just watch. And you will see an extraordinary thing taking place. If we do like this, if we watch ourselves like this, he says that you will see an extraordinary thing taking place. And what that extraordinary thing he says is, you not only put an end to an activity which is unconscious. He says that we are going to put the end to an activity which is unconscious, because we most of us our activities are unconscious. He says this, most of the activities are unconscious. Without our knowledge, it will keep on happening. So we are going to put an end to that activity which is unconscious. You not only bring that to an end, he says that we are not going to end that activity which is unconsciousness, but also further he says you are aware of the motives of that action. So he says that which we were doing unconsciously, doing some action unconsciously, we'll come to know, we'll be aware of that motives of that action without inquiry, without digging into it. If you just watch ourselves without condemnation, without identification, without comparison. Further, he says, when you are aware, you see the whole process of your thinking and action. See, when we are aware, then we will come to know the whole process of our thinking and the way we act. If we are aware, we are going to have that awareness. No, if you are aware, you see the whole process of your thinking and action. But he says this can happen only when there is no condemnation. We have to do this without condemning. And further, he says, when we condemn something, I do not understand it. Without condemnation, we have to watch. As soon as we condemn, we cannot understand it. And it is, he says, it is one way of avoiding. See, as soon as we see something, if we start condemning, it is one way of avoiding it. And we have been, most of us do that purposefully. He says that condemning, most of us do it purposefully. And we condemn immediately. We condemn immediately, we say that we understood it. If we do not condemn, see, he says, if we do not condemn, but if we regard it or aware of it, then the content, the significance of that action begins to open up. If we don't condemn that action, if we regard it or aware of it, that content which we were avoiding, which we were condemning, is going to open open up. He says experiment. he is not giving lecture. He says that experiment with it. Experiment with this. You will see for yourself. Just be aware. He says, just be aware without any sense of justification. Don't give any justification for that. Just be aware. He says, just be being aware. He says it might look negative, but he says it is not negative. On the contrary, it has the quality of passivity. He says that being aware is not negative. He says that it is passive, quality of passivity, which is direct action. He says that is the being aware is the direct action, and you will discover this if you experiment with it. He says that discover yourself. You're going to discover yourself. After all, if you want to understand something, you have to be in a passive mode. He says if we want to understand something, we need to be in a passive mode. He's asking the question, do you not? You cannot keep on thinking about it, speculating about it, questioning it. See, we have to be in a passive mood to understand something. We cannot keep questioning it, keep thinking about, keep speculating about it. You have to be sensitive to receive the content of it. He says that we need to be very sensitive to receive the content of it. He gives the example of that. You should be like a sensitive photographic plate. How sensitive the photographic plate is, it captures everything at that moment. We need to be very sensitive. He says, he gives an example. If I want to understand you, I have to be passively aware. He says that if he wants to understand us, he says that he need to be passively aware. Then we are going to tell the story. If we want to listen to somebody, we need to be very passively aware. Surely that is not a question of capacity or specialization. He says that being passively aware is not a question of capacity or specialization. For that, we need not to have a capacity, and we need not to have a specialization for that. He says that in that process, we begin to understand ourselves. He says that being aware when we are listening to somebody, then what happens? He says that in that process, we begin to understand ourselves. Not only the superficial layers of our consciousness. He says that not only the outer layers of consciousness, but also the deeper, which is more important. He says that the deeper conscious is more important, because there in the deeper place it is there are all our motives hidden, intentions, our hidden confused demand, anxieties, fears, appetites, all are there. We are going to understand two types of things. One is superficial layers of our consciousness, and the deeper layer of our consciousness. In the deeper layer, everything is hidden there, because there are all our motives, our intentions, our hidden confused demands, anxieties, fears, appetites, all there inside. Outwardly we may have them all under control. We may be thinking that outside, that we are under control of, we are controlling all the things which are there inside, but inwardly they are boiling. He says that inwardly they are boiling, but we think that we are controlling outwardly. Until those have completely understood the things which are there inside us, unless we understand, completely understood through awareness, until those have been completely understood through awareness, if you don't understand that completely, until then, obviously there cannot be freedom. Till we understand all the things which are hidden inside us, we will not have any freedom. There cannot be any happiness. We will not have any happiness. And he says there is no intelligence. We will not have any intelligence till we understand everything which is there in the hidden consciousness of ours.